Right, so it is 2024, and having spent 2023 planting a tree for every day, it's probably about time I went through and checked how they're all doing. I'm going to do it in sections because I divided a lot of the tree planting into different sections so that it was easier to water them day by day. So there's 7 different sections, and we're going to be starting with section 1 today. Section 1 is in what I refer to as the sicklebush field. So this is an area where I have been encouraging up local trees between a line of old mango trees and a line of old guava trees, so mangoes north, guavas south, and we are at the western end, which I haven't currently scythed this year, where there are a few rain trees, which are these quite large bushy trees here, which are called rain trees because they have a particular type of sap-sucking bug, which in the dry season can make it seem like it's raining underneath them. And there's also a few terminalias and a lot of guavas popped up here, but we'll check on the trees now. So furthest west we have this little Coquitzapotle, which is the Mexican apple, which is Casimira edulis. This is one that went in quite recently to replace a pecan that just didn't thrive here. The pecan had lasted longer than usual because it had the shade of this young guava tree here, but eventually that was not enough and it just failed, so I've replaced it with something that can survive our full sun if it's established before that really becomes an issue with the drying out. The only other tree up in this section is this little Yucca gigantea, which should become pretty massive. It's got a couple of companion plants. It's been doing fine. It did get sunburned early on, but since it's got wetter, it's growing really nicely, so I'm pleased with that. As we come under the guava trees, we have this nice fig has seeded itself. This is, I think, a Cape fig. It's one of the edible wild figs. We have about 30 species of fig native in Zambia. And this one is quite palatable to me, but these ones did get covered in ants and scale, so I didn't eat as many as I usually do, and the birds also seem to have neglected them because of the ants. And then we are into the area of the eponymous sickle bushes. So there was a thicket here, but they seem to be doing what sickle bushes sometimes do as the soil changes and just dying. There's just a sort of circle of them have died here. And I do think that is because the soil has become less bacterial and more fungal, which often leads to the sort of early colonization trees just dropping out. In the middle of this area that is changing, we have something that shouldn't mind that at all. So this is Adansonia digitata, which is the African bearbeb. You can see it is not currently bare at all. It is coming up really nicely. They are quite slow growing relative to their adult size, but they can really put out quite a lot of growth quite quickly. You can see there's already been like sort of 10 centimeters of growth on a lot of these branches just since the rain started. So here we have a little bit of a disaster, which is where I had planted 5 cashew trees around a queen palm, so that's Anacardium around Syagris, and all of those died. I didn't initially count the cashews, and they came back to life, and a couple of them got trampled, and the rest just dehydrated when we were away from my grandmother's funeral. But you can see this lemon tree, which was leafless when I put it in and just budding up, has really pushed out. So this is Citrus extemporis, so not a true lemon, but a rough lemon, which I prefer. And most of the rest here have been replaced with Pachira glabra, which is the sabernut. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4 of those, and they're all coming up, they're all leafing up all right. And the palm in the middle I replaced with a Cereus cactus. We've done better with queen palms at the sort of junction between 2 sections, because I have divided this field into 8 sections, I think, with low hedges of succulents, things like this Kalanchoe fetchinkoi down in here, and also the thorn of Christ, but that's not in this bit. So the queen palms that I put here to mark the gateway between 2 sections have both been coming up. This one still hasn't got as mature leaves, but it is pretty healthy, so I'm happy enough with that. And this section you can see I haven't fully scythed, so we're still quite chaotic here, but this is where I planted the 4 palms that I think are Hyphane, which is the Lala palm, which is one of the native ones. I'm not entirely sure, they might be a saw palmetto, but I don't think that's very common here. This one is doing nicely. You've got a new leaf coming up in the middle, and somewhere through this very long grass we have another who is probably thriving quite a lot in the shade. The grass isn't a problem for a lot of plants like this. The issue is that it becomes flammable, which is why keeping it down is an endless challenge. But you can see this one also has a nice new leaf coming up in there. It's coming up all right. And this is where I replaced a custard apple with a portulacaria. I'm not convinced the custard apple is dead. It is still firmly rooted in there, but portulacaria is alive and pretty vigorous, so that's alright one way or another. Another of the hopefully Lala palm, and it is again doing pretty well despite significantly more sun, especially in the afternoon, because here is just wide open for afternoon sun. And over here the little bullock's heart or smooth custard apple that I planted. So this is an Annona reticulata. Did get badly burnt. When it first went in, these are a little bit more sun sensitive than squamosa usually, but you can see it springing back really nicely. And despite being tiny, this Sabana is completely fine. Its Dracaena is toast, so I might put another marker here, but this one is currently fine. And the last of these palms in this section is also doing okay. Next up, we're in another section that didn't do so well. So there was a lychee here, there is now a Sabanut, because this was too exposed, it turned out, for the lychees as the sun moved. It did have pretty good shade, but then this guava sapling here decided it was going to drop all its leaves. It's not really a sapling anymore, it's kind of graduated, and then that got toasted. The balsa, despite being a fairly thirsty tree, is coming up pretty well now. It did go almost leafless during the dry season, but I'm hoping that means that they will be reasonable here as a sort of quick establishment tree for areas where I want something high and I want something fast to shelter other more sensitive plants. But it's, yeah, you can see it's done all this growth in the last few days. They are one of the fastest growing trees once they get moving, so hopefully it will pick up soon. You can see this is stretching out pretty nicely and a lot of new leaves coming up here. This is one of the few that I didn't replace, so this was another lychee seedling. It is still very firmly rooted, unlike the other, and I did mean to put a replacement here, but I forgot in the dark, but it is currently vacant. And in here is one of the more mystifying losses. So this was one of the Artocarpus, which had been doing absolutely fine through the dry season, which is usually the part where they struggle, and then when the rains hit, it just disappeared. There wasn't even a stick left, it was just gone. So I think possibly something ate it. I'm not entirely sure, it was just gone. But the companion plants are all here, and this is in what will be the hedge line. There is somewhere in there a Sclerocaria, which is the Marula. So that is coming up really nicely, having gone in as a tiny little seedling, I think 3 years ago now. You can see this is quite extensive, and you can see all of this from here up is this year's growth, which is really fantastic. Over here you have a Marula that went in this year, so just opposite to that. They should be able to pollinate if one is male, one is female. If not, there might be some grafting involved at some point. You can see also, again, some really nice growth coming up here. They really respond very quickly once the rain does hit, because this was the highest point when it went in, and now all the way up to here. And down in here, which will soon be the sub-canopy for that, hopefully, we have a little Eugenia uniflora, which is the Suriname cherry. And you can see, despite them usually really suffering in full sun, this one has been out most of the dry season, and it has really taken very well. There's no real shelter here for the morning sun or the midday sun. There's a little, now there's some leaf on it from the sickle bush in the afternoon sun, but there wasn't in a lot of the dry season. And this should hopefully also cope here. This will need to keep low around it, so this is Cereus repandus, I think, so this is a Peruvian apple. You can see it's got another shoot coming up there. I'll probably take one of these off because I do much more like them to branch above sort of passing height, but it is coping pretty well. It hasn't grown much from its main stem since the rains came, a little bit, but not much. But it should be pretty tolerant of the shade, provided I can keep the sort of surrounding area from getting too stagnant once it's mature. So I'll just need to keep the vegetation low immediately around it. So once it's established, this will probably have to come out if it doesn't get crowded out anyway. So this was one of the early plantings. This was a transfer of some seedlings of Syzygium guineensis, I think, which had popped up somewhere. They weren't really wanted, and I thought I could plant them here, and then if they survived on both sides, I'd end up knotting them into one tree. They did survive on the side that is more sheltered. So down in here, you've got two seedlings have survived, which I'll probably end up platting together. They're coming up really nicely, especially now the rain has come. They did show signs of life a while ago, whereas on this side, I think the last stump of one, the last stump of one has finally just rotted away, so there is really nothing there. But this should be a nice, fairly dense shade tree, which should help shelter things, stop the wind moving too much here, and that should be good. And just before we head through to the next section, we have another Savanite who's looking really nice and green. You can see this is in quite a good bit of shade, so we've got some nice sickle bush there, and we've actually got a baobab herself seated in there, as well as a monkey bread tree, and this big old guava here, which is going to need some significant cutting back, because this is really here for sort of biomass accumulation. This is not somewhere I want a guava tree in the long term. So here's the self-seeded monkey bread, which I always think should be in Bauhinia. I don't think it actually is, but it's got a wonderful edible pod. It's quite a beautiful tree. It tends to be quite low and spreading. You can see it's pushing its way up in the shade of the sickle bush. It's another early arrival usually, but it is more fungal. It just doesn't like to be soggy through the dry season. There's another self-seeded in here, which I'm fairly sure is a baobab at this point. It's growing a slightly strange leaf, but it is in pretty dense shade. It's definitely Bombaceae as far as I can see. But it's coming up really nicely, really fast. It's losing its leaf in time with the other baobab, so I do think I'm right there. But I don't know how it's seeded itself here. It's not the environment for them naturally. So once we're through those, we're into probably the most planted section, which is the southeastern section, which is bounded on the south by the guava trees as usual, and then sickle bushes and a few little bits and pieces I've put on the other two sides. Right in the center of that, we have Rolf the Revolvia, which is the wild quinine tree, who is in more sun than they'd usually like, but is really thriving despite having salt quite a lot over the dry season. It's really good to see that. Just opposite him, where I'd hoped it would one day sort of tangle into his canopy, we do have the Dracaena is the tree. There was a whole complicated combination of things went in here that could kind of be considered trees. So there's African milkbush in there, there's the speckboom, there's Aloe arborescens, which isn't a tree but is on some tree lists in some countries. But the real focus of the planting was a giant pawpaw, which has not thrived. That did get toasted when we were away for the funeral. And here we have a loquat that was one of those that went in to replace a... Here we have a very upset African migrant who's got tangled in a, what looks like a golden orb-weaver's web, but the golden orb-weaver doesn't seem to be home. There's the butterfly, it's free for now. Oh no, still a bit of web. Yeah, these are quite a beautiful butterfly. You'll often see them mud puddling towards the end of the rains in large numbers. It just isn't staying still currently, because it's tangled in web. This is very helpful butterfly. There we go. Yeah, so here we have a loquat, which is Areobotria japonica, which I put in to replace an avocado, Passia americana. The avocados I had a really bad year with. They were all transfers, and some years they transfer fine, but this year they really didn't. I think I have one surviving, but that's in a different section. But yeah, the loquat is really happy with this. It did go in just before the rains arrived, so it's not likely to have a problem, at least for a few months. They do seem to be pretty hardy. I planted much smaller ones and had no problems. I think I've lost one loquat at all, not this year, but in a previous year when I planted out a seedling that was just a bit too dry and in too compacted soil. But this one is happy. Down here somewhere there is, hopefully still, there was the other day, yeah, here we go. Right in amongst this Kalanchoe. So this is Kalanchoe fetchinkoi, the lavender scallops all around from Madagascar. So in here you can see another Suriname cherry coming up beautifully. They are a bit slow to get started. They'll usually spend a couple of years settling in and then just shoot up. But this one actually is putting upward shoots pretty quickly. And yeah, there's another shoot in there. And another tree I tend to find pretty indestructible here is the amla, which is Philanthus emblica, I think. So this is the Indian gooseberry. It's a beautiful, beautiful little tree. It's very light crowned, so it's a good one for sort of mixed plantings because it's not going to interfere too much. But it's also got an edible fruit, very sour fruit, but edible. And it grows pretty fast, and you can see all of this green here has come off this trunk down here since the rains hit. In here, quite close to the corner, we have another Sabanite who is coming up nicely, slowly, compared to the Placanthus all around. So this is the sweat bush. It's a great one for butterflies. People plant it to scare off snakes, but it doesn't, which is good because I like snakes. But in here, yeah, we have this little Sabanut all tangled in that, and you've got some nice new leaves coming along since the rain arrived. And with the Sabanut over there, just here is where we planted a Carpentaria on Easter Sunday. Did not thrive. This is way too much exposure. There was, at the time, decent shade for the afternoon from this big sickle bush here, but then the sickle bush dropped all its leaves and that went away. And with me heading out of town, it was not an ideal time to be a Carpentaria this exposed, so it got toasted. So that is gone. And over here, in the sub-canopy of the same big sickle bush, we have a nice little bullock's heart or smooth custard apple. So this is another Annona reticulata. It's coming along really nicely. Of the Annonas I've planted, apart from the Beriba, which isn't always put in Annona, I think the reticulata is the one I haven't lost any of. Again, I have tended to put it in more shade because it is a little bit more sensitive usually than the Annona squamosa, so it is a bit of a skew. It's because it's more fragile. I've treated it more fragilely, but it's coming up nicely. And then if we head in here, this is the boundary between the area where I have the cashews, and the area that we're currently in. We've got in here another Articarpus, so this is jackfruit. This is actually one that really suffered, so it was really not well when I put it in. It had gone without water for a while and it was a bit wilted, but it sprung back up, as they tend to, and then you can see the top of the twig is dead here, because when it finally decided it was going to grow, it was just in time for the rose beetles to emerge, the little brown beetles that eat soft leaves on just about anything, and they eat it right back down and it really suffered, but you can see some lovely green life coming up in again there. We are also just starting to get life on this little African milk bush. So this is Euphorbia bicompacta, I think. So you've got some tiny little leaves springing up there. This has actually done better than most because most of them have died back to here. This is a very tough plant. It is, I don't think it's indigenous this far south, but it is indigenous in Africa and in similar environments. But it usually is very tough, but usually in a little bit more shade. And most of the ones I planted lost everything above like an inch above the soil. They've rooted well and they are starting to show signs of regeneration, but this one, although it's leafing there, it's actually stayed alive and succulent all the way up, so it might even grow from the top once it's recovered enough. And just a couple of feet away from there was another pecan, so that's the Carya illinoinensis, but they really didn't have a good year and that one died, so I replaced it with a nice mulberry, so this will come up nicely and that will instead form the canopy for our milk bush to relax a little bit and also help shelter that jackfruit we saw just now. And also going to be in its shade is another bullock's heart or smooth skinned custard apple just here. This bit, we've got a couple of seedlings that have to come out. So this is a syringa. I'm not sure which one, but it is not native. It's an Indian tree and it is quite invasive, but they're perfectly good biomass accumulators, so I'll just let it get a little bit bigger. I might use it as a pole, but I'll chop side branches off at the very least and feed them to the soil. And another guava who will definitely have to come up, because with these big ones here, any guavas trying to come up in here, the fruit gets full of fruit fly larvae, because there's just no way to stay on top of the amount of fruit these produce. They're just too close together and too many. We've got a little fig I planted a while ago, so this should be another Cape fig. I'm not sure. It came up in a propagator without a seed of a fig being planted in there, so we will see what it is when it fruits. But it's coming along really nicely. It did go completely leafless during the dry season, and you can see all of this lovely greenery on it now. And here is where I planted one of the Elias, the African oil palms, and it got toasted. But we do have a very lovely little soursop which I planted in its place, which is coming along really nicely. Nice waxy leaves, really nice and firm. So I'm really pleased with that. And not far from that we have, of course, a Sabanut. And of course, as almost all the Sabanuts I planted are doing, it is doing really nicely. So it's got some of the original leaves that went in, which not all of them have. A lot of them went completely bald during the dry season, so this is one of the originals. But this is all new growth, which for a newly established, fairly small sapling is not bad at all. And over there I replaced the other oil palm with a tree aloe, which should really help stop the wind coming through, because the wind comes from that direction. There's a big old pine in the way, but this should really help it much more close to and stop everything getting dried out by that, because it can come right under a lot of these guavas, and trying to get things established under these guavas is difficult because the guavas are always dropping things on them. And in here we have another jackfruit. This is actually a little bit established. It did go in early. I think this was the first jackfruit I planted this year, and it is coming up all right. You can see it did suffer a little bit in the heat. There's a little dead twig here, but yeah, it's got some new openings opening up along the stem, and it's got one of its original leaves still, and it's not too bad. It is in more shelter than it looks like. It's not getting a lot of morning sun at the moment. We've got the nice winter thorn here, which is only just dropping its leaves, having been pretty leafy all through the dry season. Now we've got a sickle bush to give some shade during the rainy season. That will eventually sulk as the soil changes and die, but for now it is giving a nice bit of shade here, and by the time it dies, hopefully the jackfruit won't need it. Just a short way away from our tree aloe, we have a nice little piece of the Suriname cherry. So this will be part of the subcanopy for the tree aloe, but it will also be hopefully another part of that sort of wind-breaking thicket. This will be a lot lower than the tree aloe, and so it should help a lot more of the wind movement down low be sort of slowed and stopped to help everything settle in all right. And we've got a little Brachystegia spiciformis, which is one of our dominant native trees. You can see the crown of a big one up over there. That's been springing up here, which is really nice. We'll have to send it up a bit so it doesn't interfere, because they can stay shrubby for a while, but I'd rather it was up and out of the way. And then another succulent edge of this little thicket. So this is a pencil tree, so this is Euphorbia tyricale. Whether it's native or not is kind of unclear. But yeah, it's very easy. You can see it putting out some new leaves here. It photosynthesizes with its stems as well as the leaves. It really doesn't need the leaves much, but it's just like a holdover, being a spurge. And then in that corner, dividing this from the next field, where we've already looked at the sort of western half, but we've got the eastern half still to look at, we have a nice little yucca, who is, as the yuccas tend to, unless something eats them from below, looking absolutely fine, really nice and green. There was a piece of one of the flame lilies down here, but I'm not seeing any sign of it sprouting up, so it might have been eaten by something, which is odd because they're kind of toxic. But yeah, there's nothing in there now, so something got that. But otherwise we're all good there. There might be some governor's plums and some wild mangoes in this line, but the first tree that's visible is a mango, a true mango that I planted a while ago, so Mangifera indica. So this is from 3 years ago again. This was a seed from one that was almost black, really dark purple black, from a friend of my father's trees. Not all mangoes breed true from seeds, but some do, so I'm curious to see what we'll get from this one. In what will want to be the shade of that mango tree, and will probably not include the sickle bush forever, because it will die back once the mango tree really starts changing the soil. We have this little sabernut, again, nice and green. This one did lose all its leaves, but these ones came out late in the dry season, and this is a new one pushing out through. We've got a nice little native calico here, so this is Calico maculata, looking nice and pale. It's not the spotted form, this is the plain leaf form, but it might develop spots. Some of them seem to switch back and forth as the light changes. In here is another spot where we did have a lychee. Lychees did not do well this year. We've got some turmeric popping up everywhere, but we've also got the Annona, this should be squamosa, which I planted in its place. You can see this did get burned again, which is real evidence this wasn't a good spot for a lychee, but it's leafing up really nicely, nice and tender leaves popping out all over. And I think this is one of the last ones I didn't actually replace, so there is still somewhere here, yeah, here, there is the stump of another lychee that went in the same day. This had more shelter. The sickle bush was sheltering it quite well through winter, but eventually the sun moved far enough south that that just wasn't the case, and this did not have a good day when that happened. It is still quite firm in there, so it might spring back. Lychees can do that from seeming completely dead, and I have got a few that I've opened up thinking they're dead and found there's some life in the roots still, but we'll see what happens there. almost completely missed it because the Dracaenas had a worse year than a lot of the companion plants because I got down to some really small bits which were not thriving, but this Saba nut is coming up nicely. Well, you can see all that's left of the Dracaena is just mush. There might still be some life underground. Sometimes that does happen and you get a Dracaena there a couple of years later having assumed it's dead. But the aloe also got killed, so this might have been something tunneling underneath, like a mole rat or something that just didn't damage the Saba nut by chance. The calico was another maculata in here and that is just gone. But yeah, the tree itself is fine. I'll probably put some more markers in to perk it up, but otherwise at least the tree's there. And then last in this section we have another really bushy little Suriname cherry. So this is one that's in a really exposed location. I only planted this here because I had found they were doing much hardier I thought they would. This is the first generation that's tolerated this much sun at all of the ones I've germinated. But this does seem to be landrace happening. But yeah, it's really nice. You've got some nice tender reddish growth here. And yeah, pretty healthy little seedling. And then we're going back through the sicklebush archway to the sort of almost last bit of this section. So dividing this last section, so this is the northeastern corner, from the southeastern corner we do have, so this is the wild plum. So this is the same family as the mango and the marula and the cashew as well. It does seem to be following in the footsteps of the first two because this is coming up really nicely. Nice waxy leaves seeming to be standing up really well. Companion plants looking good, so I'm very happy with that. And here, somewhere in amongst this pigeonwood, we have the replacement tree for a phoenix, which we're going to see in a moment. So this is a Bauhinia variegata, which is the Singapore orchid tree. So it's a lovely South Asian tree, quite widespread, not just in Singapore, but it is the national flower there. And they're very tough. Most of them have done really well. That went in to replace this, so it's about a meter away. This might actually come back. No, it's still holding on. Phoenix reclinata is unlike most of the phoenix in that it suckers quite vigorously. So when the central stem looks dead, unlike a lot of palms, there can still be recovery. Not always though, and the phoenix have not done well this year. Palms generally, apart from Livistona and Carpentaria, which I've mostly planted in shade, have not done well this year, but phoenix have done particularly badly. And we have our other wild plum, Heptatorum. So this is, again, you've got less growth. You can see before I got it, white markings on the leaf. Presumably someone treated the leaves or something, I'm not sure. But yeah, above that you can see the plain leaves are all new growth since the rains and looking really nice, soft and waxy and healthy. And over here we have another Bauhinia. This is a much larger leafed one. This is one I actually bought. It was on special offer. I wouldn't usually pay money for a non-native Bauhinia, but this was a Bauhinia ex Blakeiana. So this is quite nice because it can't become invasive, unlike the variegata, which in parts of Zambia is. So this is a beautiful flower tree, but it's sterile because it's a hybrid between the variegata and the purpuriana, I think. So it is, yeah, it's a pretty tree. It should get nice and big. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it should improve this area. You can see there's some mangoes around here because this is one of the old mango trees who does need a little bit more shelter sometimes because in hotter years it tends to be very short of fruit. This year it's actually fruited all right, but kind of erratically, so some sides are entirely fruitless, and hopefully having a bit more canopy around here will help with that. But yeah, this little Bauhinia is looking nice, and you've got all these leaves are new since the rains because it turned into a dead twig. This is the original crown over the dry season and has just sprung back since the rain came. And then we've got our last pencil tree of the section, I think. So this was a big one that I planted in a shady spot, so I wasn't sure it would thrive here and not get sunburned. But it was starting to interfere with the Madagascan pencil tree, which I really wanted for the spot. This was just there as a sort of marker, effectively, and this was getting too big, and they weren't playing well together, so I cut it down at ground level, planted it out, and you can see it's not only thriving, it is also fruiting, which might be a problem, might not. They don't always do that well from seed, so it might just not spring up everywhere. If it does, I will have to weed it out because they can if they're too dense, start to affect the soil in a way that isn't great. So this is the moringa that I planted quite recently in what has historically been a very bare dead patch of soil, but clearly digging a hole in it has opened it right up, and it is now getting overgrown quite fast. This has now been inside twice this year, but yeah, it's right next to this heptaplurum. And so we've got what currently looks like our biggest disappointment of the year. This was a parinari, which I planted, I think, on the anniversary of Livingston's death. So the parinari is the impundu, which is a tree which does quite a lot of tie to the story of David Livingstone, who was an early missionary who came to Zambia. Less awful than some of the people who came after him, with some really interesting stories surrounding him. But it didn't thrive. They don't transplant well generally, they don't germinate well generally. But there is still a stump in there, and that's the root of one of the calincos. But we'll see, they do sometimes pop back up from seemingly nothing. But currently there is nothing there, so it's not on the list. And when that seemed dead, I planted something to create a little bit of shade here, which is the Madagascan umbrella tree, or Madagascan almond. So this is Terminalia manteli, I think, which is a lovely layered tree when it's mature. It's very hardy here. They're very popular along a lot of the roads because they grow fast and they are very striking. Possibly a little too popular, but they are Terminalia. We have a lot of native Terminalias, so they are food for a lot of native insects, so I don't dislike them. And over here we had a queen palm, so Syagris romanzaphiana, which died. And so of course I replaced it with a sava nut. So sava nuts are everywhere. And then we have our continuation from the sava nut to another Cereus. So this was one from cutting, and you can see it's more or less doubled in size since the rain came. So this line here, a little female eared katydid, but young one. But this line here is where the growth for this rainy season started. You can see this sort of colour shift between new growth and older, greener growth. It's coming really nicely. Hopefully it won't need this piece of dead bamboo as a marker for too long. But that should again form a little bit of a windbreak for things coming into here. I will have to keep things low around it itself, but that's alright because this is going to be a pathway just here. So that will be open anyway, so there should be air movement, which is what they seem to need once mature to stop them from rotting. And finally, I'm really pleased that this is doing well. So we have not Kochitsapotl, which we started this one with, but Chikotsapotl. So this is the last one in the sicklebush field. It's not the last of section 1. There's 3 more trees outside of this that just got lumped in for convenience. You can see some lovely new growth coming up. It did get a bit of sunburn when it first started growing, but these are coming up nicely because there's enough water now that it can cool itself down, not trouble itself too much about that sunburn. So this is one of the Central American ones, which you might guess from Chikotsapotl. And it should be quite nice, sort of cinnamony flavoured fruit once it's mature. Then, so the first area that got lumped in with area 1 is this fairly open. It's not really lawn, it's just the grass doesn't really grow high, and we tend to keep it cut. We don't even water it. But this little weird rectangle of lawn where we've been planting various succulents over the years. So this is a Phacrea, which can become tree-like. I haven't counted them as trees this year because they flower once and die, which the ones I have planted of that are ones that sucker, which this being a Phacrea rather than agave doesn't sucker, which is really convenient because you then don't get impenetrable thickets, but it does mean you then have to replant every time they flower, which isn't too often. And then we have a pandanus. This is Tectorius, not one of the native ones. This is one of the South Asian ones. And then the tree that we actually come to look at. So in keeping with the succulents, our only tree in this section is this Jamaicoa, I think. So this is another of the Cereus cactuses. Should produce an edible fruit. You've got little mantis using the space here. Most of the time, any small tree will have at least one mantis on, and by the end of the rains there will be only one because they eat each other. But then this is growing up really nicely. You can see this constriction here. That is where it stopped growing at the end of the rain. Something has eaten a little bit of it in there. There's a little hole, but it still managed to put out. This must be sort of a foot of growth, so about 30 centimeters, and that's really pleasing. You can see with this sort of woolly top, there's still some growth happening in there, so that's really nice to see. And we've got a nice big aloe to sort of finish this. This is not one I've counted as a tree. I have planted this a few times. This is a hybrid. So this is a hybrid between probably Aloe arborescens and Aloe thrasci, I think, was what I was told. but it's a huge stalk. It does tend to fall over when you get that, but it's looking alright. Our next little outlier is on the edge of this little wasteland. So this was a vegetable garden, but the soil is completely exhausted. So the plan in the long term is to put raised beds in here, so I haven't been planting trees inside, but to stop the dust from what is usually very bare compacted soil blowing into the house and onto the cars and everywhere. I have planted what will one day be a windbreak, so this is another of the Madagascan umbrella trees, or Madagascan almonds, terminally amantly, which should spread up really nicely and fill out and sort of close off this opening so we don't get covered in dust. You can see some surviving birds like chilies, because they will survive anywhere. Our final two outliers of this system are again between a line of mangoes and another line of mangoes on the other side of that wasteland bit. So this actually is a field I haven't given a name to because I haven't previously done much in here. It's kind of inaccessible generally. But you can see there's a few things that come up. So this is one of the native violet trees. It's a lovely thing. I call it sycamore violet because the seed is very much like a sycamore pod. And there's a few guavas popped up, of course, and nice albizia, some jacarandas, and a lot of lantana that needs to come out. But in here I planted two trees this year. So one of them should end up dominating this field, if it's what I think it is. And that is down in here, completely lost in the growth, but it shouldn't be for too long. This should be Dendrocalamus, which is the giant bamboo, and you can see the leaves coming up here. It's looked pretty good all through the dry season. This grass needs to come out because it is going to interfere with it, but I think that will be a two-handed job when I'm not holding a camera. I did plant an agave here, just the one, and you can see it's doing what agaves do. There's suckers everywhere, and we've also got prickly pear there. So this is the Ficus indica, so it's also called a barberry fig. And it hasn't actually produced new leaves yet, which is unusual. Most of them have, but the sort of focus here itself is this little bamboo, and that should become huge eventually. Now, just where it shouldn't be interfered with too much by that, although they're also pretty tolerant of shade, so it shouldn't be an issue. I just have to go around this section because there is a biggish cobra sometimes uses this area. We have our last tree for section 1. So this is Kigelia africana. So this is the sausage tree. We do also have another one, temporarily forgotten the name here. It's a lovely native flowering shrub. Well, shrub/climber down in here. But there's Kigelia africana, which has suckered quite vigorously actually. So this is the sausage tree. It's not an edible sausage. It is a very useful cosmetic medical sausage. It has some other applications as well. I think it might be antihelminthic, but I wouldn't use it internally because it's not the best thing to ingest. But it is coming up really nicely. This whole little branch here is brand new. There's some of these leaves, so this is the last, the original leaves height-wise, so everything above there is after the rains came in. So I'm really pleased with how that's doing. These are really firm already, so that's really good. And hopefully it'll have some more growth before the end of the rains. So that should be the end of section 1. I will put the other 6 up hopefully this month. Maybe some of them will go into February, but we'll see.